Okay, so let's start this. That's to say, there we go. Everybody, like I said, I'm Adele Krach from Food Focus, and once again this morning it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you to the 4th webinar this year of the Dairy Standard Agency. Like I said, this is the If you've missed the previous sessions, we had a session on the introduction to the DSA and their services, on biosecurity, and last month, if you've missed it, don't worry, if you go to our website, www.foodfocus.co.za, you will see on the home page, we've got a button that says resources. And if you hover with your mouse over resources, it brings up a link that says webinar. And if you click on there, you will be able to see the previous recordings of the sessions that I've just mentioned. Jacqueline, once again, you and your team are making sure that you're capturing the audience with very, very interesting topics. And it's so wonderful that you guys are focusing on making sure that we assist the dairy industry with topics like this. Today, like I said, we will be speaking about mycotoxins in dairy. Know your risk. During this webinar, our speaker, Caitlyn de Vos from Vitam International, will topics. What are mycotoxins? Where do they come from? And also in terms of, sorry guys, I've just got a little glitch there. Like I said, what are mycotoxins and where do they come from? And why are they formed? We've got the negative impact of mycotoxins in dairy cows, and then aflatoxins in dairy products, a human health risk, managing your mycotoxin risks from detection to mitigation, and how to choose the correct mycotoxin binder. So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce you to our speaker. Our speaker for today is Caitlyn de Vos. Caitlyn, welcome. It's so nice to have you as part of the panel. And I'm quickly just going to read, you can see it on the slide. In any event, Caitlyn's very interesting CV and where she comes from. So like I said, she is from Vitam International. There she's fulfilling the role of the Ruminant Development Manager. And she's responsible for the Sub-Saharan Africa, and she's also involved in marketing and technical and research and development projects. She's been with the company since 2019, and she completed her MSc degree in animal nutrition at the University of Pretoria, focusing on the effects of feed additives on the amino acid composition of ruminal bacteria. It's all very big words, this. When I spoke to her earlier on, I had to clarify some of these words because it's not my side of work. But Caitlyn has a keen interest in I nearly said it wrong again, ruminant nutrition, particularly dairy nutrition, with a focus on the ruminal microbiome, mycotoxins, and the role of feed additives in optimizing ruminant production and health. She has a passion for the knowledge and constantly looking for further, and not only for her own, but also to share her knowledge like she's going to do today for those who want to learn more. Caitlyn, it's really a pleasure having you, and we are really looking forward to your presentation. And I'm going to hand over to you now, and then you can start your presentation.
Thanks, Del.
Okay, that is to say if it wants to give me the button. Just quickly see. Just see. Sorry, Caitlyn, for some other reason.
No problem.
It doesn't want to. Okay, let me just try this again. There we go.
There we go, Del. All right, I think everyone can see my screen now and hear me clearly. All right, so good day, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to say a big thank you to the Food Focus team, Adele, all of them for actually reaching out to me and getting me involved in today's webinar. As Adele mentioned, I really like to be involved in these types of events. I like to share my knowledge and really be involved with our industry, from the dairy producers through to the milk buyers. So, as Adele said, the topic today is mycotoxins in dairy, know your risk. And this is an extremely broad topic, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a crash course, really, in mycotoxins. What are mycotoxins? Where do they come from? What actually causes them to be produced? What the negative impacts of mycotoxins are on a dairy cow, and how we can try and protect them. And what I really do want to touch on today is the negative impact of mycotoxins and the threat that they place to human health, which I will elaborate on a little bit later. So I hope you all enjoy. Please ask questions and I'll address them at the end of the webinar. All right, so what are mycotoxins? Well, mycotoxins are secondary metabolites produced by a species of fungi known as molds. Why molds produce mycotoxins is not yet fully understood, but it's thought to be a part of their chemical defense system. So when they become stressed or environmental conditions are unfavorable, they then start to produce these mycotoxins. Some other theories are that possibly these mycotoxins play a role in helping prepare the molds to actually digest the substrates or the crop that they're growing on, and then to promote fungal growth, to promote colonization of that crop. Not all molds produce mycotoxins, and the most common mycotoxin producing molds belong to your Aspergillus, Fusarium, Penicillium, Claviceps, and Alternaria populations, or species, I should say, of molds. To date, we know that there are countless mycotoxins. At the moment, we are aware of about 400 different mycotoxins, but with advancements in technology, we find that there are more and more. If we look at the ones that are of the greatest importance in terms of agriculture, this is deoxynivalenol, so you're going to hear me say DON for short throughout this presentation, fumonisins, zearalenone, aflatoxins, ochratoxin, and T2 toxin. And the real challenge with mycotoxins is that they have a significant negative impact on the health and productivity of animals, but you don't really find them in feed. You don't see them, I should say. They're invisible to the eye, they're odorless, so there's no real way of you knowing that they are there. And the real difficulty is that they're pretty indestructible. They are resistant to decomposition, digestion, and degradation. So it's really quite difficult to remove them once they are there. So where are mycotoxins? Well, unfortunately, they're everywhere. So the FAO estimates that 25% of agricultural commodities are contaminated with mycotoxins. And the map that I have here on the screen highlights a 10-year global study that was done from 2008 to 2017 by Gruber Döringer. And they assessed regional differences and year-to-year variation in mycotoxin contamination globally. So basically what you can see here is that they divided the world into 15 geographic areas, and they analyzed various finished feeds and raw materials in the study. So maize, wheat, soybean, DDGS, your silages, all of these were analyzed. In total, just shy of 75,000 samples were analyzed in this study. And what they found is that unfortunately, there's a really high level of mycotoxin contamination, and that in fact 88% of the samples tested contained at least one mycotoxin. If you have a look at all the different countries globally, you'll see that the issue really lies with your fusariums, which you can see are present in most countries, also with your DON, which we find very frequently, and then ZEA. In your more tropical countries, your Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, where it's also a lot drier, then we tend to see a lot more aflatoxin. But really the main risk lies with DON, fumonisin, and ZEA. And if we zoom into South Africa a little bit, what you can see is that DON was found in 63.2% of the samples, fumonisin in 62.6% of the samples, and ZEA in 41.6% of the samples. So it's very clear that this is actually the risk we're facing here in South Africa. And they found DON in almost every South African commodity, which is quite scary. And what they found is that aflatoxin is actually less prevalent in South Africa, particularly in our maize and our cereals. So it is there, but it's not the real challenge that we are facing. Then this is just a graph which I took from the SAGL maize report from the 2019-2020 season. And what I really want to highlight here is that you can see year on year, we have an increase in the occurrence of DON. So in the 2019-2020 season, 85% of the samples, so that's yellow and white maize, tested positive for DON. Okay. What we also see is that there's been a slight increase in ZEA, and that's quite typical. As I'll explain earlier, you tend to see DON and ZEA together. And then we also tend to see quite high levels of fumonisin. In this particular crop quality report, they concluded that low levels of aflatoxin were detected, and that in our maize that we are producing locally, we don't find ochratoxins. And here at Vitam, we as a service analyze raw materials for our clients, and we're seeing this exact same pattern where most of the time we are finding DON and ZEA in the samples that we are testing, and only from time to time other mycotoxins. So where do these mycotoxins come from? Well, there are 4 potential areas where molds and mycotoxins can develop. One is in the field before crop growth, so when we're preparing the fields, but then also during crop growth. They can also occur at harvest or when we ensile, and then during processing and storage. So those are the 4 areas where we can see them. And each area gives rise to a specific set of mycotoxins. And so very broadly, we tend to classify mycotoxins in 2 categories: your field mycotoxins and your storage mycotoxins. So as I said, mold development and mycotoxin production starts in the field. And there's various factors that influence this. For example, the variety that you choose, what fungal species are present. Did you produce maize in that field last year and now you're producing maize again? Because that increases the risk for molds. And what other microflora might be there? How do you prepare the soil before you actually plant? That is also another factor that comes in. Then during crop growth, there are many factors, and they are very much linked to the environment. So your temperature, humidity, rainfall, pH of the soil. Molds are actually very sensitive to this, and they pick up these changes. Mechanical injury and insect damage. These are very well known to increase aflatoxin contamination in a crop. If there's been hail damage, insect or bird damage, we tend to see higher levels of aflatoxins and also your fumonisins. Yeah, but your general agricultural practices, what approach you take to applying fungicides, all of those are factors during crop growth that can increase the risk for mycotoxins. And then during harvesting, one of the biggest factors is actually crop maturity. So making sure that you are cutting at the right time, at the right moisture content. And then the conditions of harvesting. It's really important that you use clean equipment when you do this. You are cutting at the correct cut height, not to bring in too much soil. All of those factors are really important. So this is where you have a risk for your fusarium molds. And your fusarium molds produce fumonisin, ZEA, DON, and your T2H-T2 toxins. Then if we move to your storage type mycotoxins, here a big factor is the cleanliness of the silos where you're storing your maize, for example, the temperature, the humidity, pest infestation. These are all things that can promote the development of molds and mycotoxins. And here we tend to find your aspergillus and your penicillin type molds. And aspergillus actually develops, a particular species of aspergillus develops on the crop. So basically you bring it in, and then there's the potential for more spores to be produced if storage is not optimal. And that gives rise to your aflatoxins and your ochratoxins. So if we look into the development of molds and mycotoxins pre-harvest, it is going to differ. The toxins that you see is going to differ across the crop that you use, the cultivar you use, and of course the crop management. But environmental conditions, in particular climate, so your temperature, your humidity, and then the current prevailing weather conditions are really the strongest determinants of mycotoxin contamination. So if we look at a few key species, one is Fusarium graminearum. So I'm sure you're all familiar with Gibberella ear rot. It's quite a common plant pathogen seen here in South Africa, and it gives rise to potentially DON and zear. So generally, Fusarium graminearum is found in your more temperate regions, and it produces DON and zear, as you can see, at quite moderate temperatures, 26 to 28 degrees Celsius, and when humidity levels are high. So we tend to see these toxins when there's rainfall or mild temperatures during flowering and maturation. And then we really see a sharp increase if there's high rainfall in that silking phase of maize. We start to see a lot more DON and zear. Then if we look at Fusarium verticuloides, we generally see this in your hotter climates. And this mold gives rise to your fumonisins. So as you can see, it requires very high temperatures to produce fumonisins and a high level of humidity. But generally, we tend to see them when there's low precipitation at silking as well, but then a high humidity. And then Aspergillus flavus, as I said, we do tend to think of it as a storage fungi, but it is actually coming from the field. And this produces your aflatoxins. And there's various conditions that lead to this, but we tend to see aflatoxins traditionally in your tropical, subtropical climates. And then in terms of weather, when you have drought stress, so dry, hot summers, you see the development and production of aflatoxin B1 in the growing crops. And then when you have warm, wet conditions, we tend to see the production of these toxins just prior to harvest, around maturation. If the crop is well irrigated, so if we're irrigating maize very well, then we don't often see high levels of Aspergillus. But as you can see, high levels of temperature are required. So at the end of the day, climate and weather conditions are really the key determinants of mycotoxin contamination. And unfortunately, you know, weather is becoming extreme. We've seen it, flooding in KZN, frost coming in later over here. There's really a shift in weather patterns. And so what we need to realize is that we're going to start seeing mycotoxins more frequently, but also different mycotoxins than we might expect in a region. So where you would expect to see your Aspergillus in your more tropical, subtropical climates, we're actually starting to now see them in more temperate regions like Europe. So there's really going to be this shift in the profile of mycotoxins. Okay, so if we look at ruminants, they are at a greater risk of exposure to mycotoxins, more so than your chickens and your pigs. And very basically, this is because they are fed a more complex diet, particularly our TMR herds. They're fed diets composed of hay, maize, oil cakes, various silages. And as a result of this, they are potentially exposed to a very diverse set of mycotoxins. And of course, one mold can also produce multiple mycotoxins, which we refer to as a mycotoxin cluster. So a crop can actually be infested with multiple strains of fungi and multiple mycotoxins. And then of course, when we mix our raw materials and produce a final feed, the risk for mycotoxin co-contamination becomes more likely. And the challenge with this is that if mycotoxins co-occur, so we call this polycontamination, their combined toxic effect can actually be synergistic. So two together can have a more toxic effect on the animal than either one toxin would have if present on its own. And if we rank the feed ingredients in terms of mycotoxin risk, pastures are generally ranked as a lower risk. We do see zear in pastures in New Zealand. They have found it quite frequently, and we are seeing it here from time to time. But there's another entire set of mycotoxins that come from pastures. And these are your ergot alkaloids and your sporidesmin, which causes your facial eczema. Then if we move on, the raw material which carry a slightly higher risk are your soybeans, your rapeseed, any of your protein meals. And here the solid shell offers some protection to the grain with the mycotoxins, and that's why there's a slightly lower risk. All right, next, your grass silage, your small cereals, your straw, your hay pose a risk. And then really your high risk raw materials are your maize silage, any maize grain and byproducts, and your oat silage. And just to give you an idea, there was a study done in 2008 in the Netherlands, and they found out that, or determined that silage actually increases the risk for mycotoxins by 3 times more than any other feed ingredient, particularly for Don. So they really are a high risk raw material. And then the highest risk is your hominy chop. And I've seen particularly high levels of contamination with hominy chop, particularly for deoxynivalenol. And the reason for this is, of course, the product contains that outer layer of the bran. And so you have this concentrating of the mycotoxins in this product. Oh, sorry, I see there's a little bit of a lag here. I've jumped one ahead. Let me just go back. All right, so as I said, maize silage carries a very high risk for mycotoxins. And so unfortunately, when we harvest, we're bringing in those Fusarium molds and mycotoxins from the field. There's nothing we can do about it. But good silage management is essential to prevent the further growth and development of molds and mycotoxins. So silage is rich in nutrients, carbon, your nitrogen, and has a high moisture content. So it's actually ideal for the growth of molds, especially if oxygen has not been properly removed. So really, in order to prevent further development of molds and mycotoxins, we need to remove oxygen as quickly as we can and keep it out. And ideally, what we want is a solution, or a situation, I should say here, where we bring in a certain amount of molds and mycotoxins off the field, that through good storage and management, we cap them right there. What we want to avoid is this situation over here on my right-hand side, where we then have accelerated and further development of molds and mycotoxins. All right, so favors that help favor mold proliferation and mycotoxin production are cutting at the wrong dry matter, so excessively wet or excessively dry, ensiling at a slower pace than you should, not compacting your silage properly, because of course you leave little pockets of oxygen there, not sealing it properly. So sealing is not throwing over a black and white plastic. You actually want to get the oxygen out. That's the real critical thing that we need to achieve. And then heating is also an issue which can help with mold development and mycotoxin production, damaged plastic wrap, and slow feed out rate. So really, you want to keep that silage as airtight as you can and prevent the development of molds and mycotoxins. Because if air comes into your silage, your lactic acid utilizing microbes sort of wake up, if you want to say, and they start being active again, and they start to utilize the nutrients that are present to them, metabolize the lactic acid, and increase the pH. And then if you combine that increase in pH with exposure to oxygen, our molds then actually start to become active and can potentially produce mycotoxins again. So can the rumen actually protect against mycotoxins? So I think for decades it's been accepted that in comparison to monogastric species, ruminant animals are less susceptible to the negative effects of mycotoxins. And yes, this is true to an extent. So if you look really closely, my yes is filled with a lot of no's. There is some truth to this. Research has shown that ruminants do have a natural ability to partially detoxify certain mycotoxins. So your DON, T2, and ochratoxin. but unfortunately, it can't protect against all mycotoxins. So what I've done here is summarized the different key mycotoxins and looked at whether they degraded or not in the rumen. So as you can see, aflatoxin research has shown up to 42% can be degraded in the rumen, but just remember that degradation doesn't necessarily mean detoxification. So typically aflatoxin is biotransformed into aflatoxicol, which is equally as toxic as aflatoxin. But the other issue is this capacity is very much affected by the diet, so the forage to concentrate ratio. If we look at Zea, very effectively degraded in the rumen, but unfortunately it's degraded to a molecule called alpha-zearalenol, and the research is actually showing that this is 4 to 10 times more toxic than Zea in the first place. So it's really not a detoxification that is happening. And then with DON, they find up to about 35% can be degraded, but this is very much dependent on the rumen pH. So when we have subacute ruminal acidosis, this is actually reduced, and we have an incomplete degradation of DON into DOM1. And then ochratoxin is one of the ones that seems to be quite effectively degraded in the rumen by your rumen protozoa. But it's also important to keep in mind that dairy cows are experiencing, they have high intake, so they are potentially consuming a high level of mycotoxins. They're under production stress. They have a higher passage rate, reducing the time before this detoxification. And for example, if they're experiencing heat stress, or it's your transition cow, your early lactation cow, she's under a lot of pressure, so you cannot be relying on the rumen to actually remove or detoxify these mycotoxins. So if we look at the toxic effects of mycotoxins in ruminants, I'm just going to run through a few things that we can see. And it very much depends on the toxin involved. So if we look at your trichothecenes, so your DON, it has targets your digestive and immune system. And what we see is immune depression, gastrointestinal disturbances, so more diarrhea, reduced feed intake, reduced utilization, absorption of nutrients. And then what we see is less milk in the tank and maybe less growth or weight loss. Fumonisin will target your liver and the brain. And again, they lead to immune depression, gastrointestinal disturbances, lower productivity, and liver toxicity. Zea is a bit different. It has a very negative impact on the reproductive system. So what we see is poor fertility, for example, lower conception rates, resorptions, hyperestrogenism, ovarian cysts. All of those are things that we start to see. Then if we look at our aflatoxins, they are highly hepatotoxic. So they really target the liver and the immune system. So we can have extensive damage done to the liver. Research has also shown that they might impair rumen function and rumen fermentation, so less mobility, less fiber digestion, less production of volatile fatty acids, and they negatively impact average daily gain and milk production. And then lastly, ochratoxins target your kidney and immune system, so they lead to immune depression, weakened kidneys. Often we might see signs of dehydration or high water consumption. But what I really want to highlight here is if you have a look, it's really hard to tell one mycotoxin apart from another. They lead to immune depression. They lead to gastrointestinal disturbances. They all result in low milk production. So the challenge with mycotoxins is that the symptoms are wide-ranging and non-specific, which makes diagnosis so difficult. And this is why we often don't realize that they are the cause for the problems that we are seeing on farm. So the primary means by which mycotoxins exert their negative effect is a reduced intestinal absorption of nutrients, and that is because of a reduced feed intake, altered microbial growth, and then irritation of the gut. The second way is immunosuppression, and then the third is alteration of reproductive performances. And this is partly through influencing the hormones, but also actually having a very negative effect on the eggs and the sperm. All right, so what research has shown is that in the presence of DON, key areas of the brain are actually activated, so certain receptors, and this is quite an immediate reaction. And basically what happens is the brain then sends a message to reduce feed intake. And so we could potentially see a negative energy balance because of this reduction in feed intake, particularly if you think of your transition cow or early lactation cow. They're already a negative energy balance. You don't want to exacerbate this. Okay, then as I mentioned, ruminal fermentation is altered by certain mycotoxins. So aflatoxin, as I said, can affect rumen function, have a negative impact on that the fermentation that is happening in the rumen. But DON has also been shown to actually alter rumen fermentation and reduce the amount of utilizable protein that reaches the intestine at the end of the day. And we can have an increased risk for low rumen pH. So we tend to see that very liquid, very typically acidotic manure in very in clinical cases. And then of course we can have this damage to the rumen papillae where we actually lose those villi, so there's less absorption potential. So if we look at the effect of mycotoxins on the gut, you need to keep in mind that the intestine is the first in the line of fire when mycotoxins are consumed. So it is damaged even before mycotoxins are absorbed and go via the liver. And with low levels of polycontamination, we often don't see clinical symptoms. And so we don't take measures to counteract mycotoxins because we don't realize that mycotoxins are actually involved. So if we look here, DON actually damages your intestinal cells. So it degrades your villi in the gut. So there's little finger-like projections that are where your nutrients are absorbed. So we tend to see shorter villi, and maybe some lost villi. And so unfortunately, this means that there's less surface area to absorb nutrients. And another thing that DON does is it actually inhibits certain nutrient transporter pathways. So it's more difficult to uptake nutrients and also water, which is why we often see this more liquid diarrhea type feces. Another thing that happens is it damages the gut barrier. So the cells of the intestine sit very closely together. And then what happens is it opens the space between these cells, which we call the tight junctions. And so it just opens the door for pathogens and toxins to actually enter through and enter into the blood. Goblet cells are also affected. So what goblet cells do is they secrete mucus. And this mucus is important because it forms this layer on top of the intestinal cells and it protects them. So it prevents your pathogenic bacteria from adhering to the gut, and then it also promotes your more favorable bacteria. So if this is thinner, which we see happen, you then have less protection of the intestinal cells. And then formamycin comes along. It tends to act in synergy with DON, and it prevents the repair of these damaged villi and damaged tissues. And so, you know, the damage just remains. There's no recovery. And then, of course, as we know, a lot of immunity lies in the gut. 70% of our immunity lies in the gut. So when you have mycotoxins damaging the gut, we see a reduction in immune function, and we tend to see immunodepression. So even at low levels, subclinical mycotoxicosis, we really are having damage done to the intestine, which is going to result in poorer performance, poor feed conversion ratio or feed efficiency, production just not being where it should be. And as I said, hard to put our finger on it. Okay, so just very briefly, as I said, we have shorter villi, less area for nutrient absorption, and then because rumen fermentation is influenced, we often see more undigested fiber in the rumen. Of course, if we have less nutrient absorption in the small intestine, more nutrients are flowing through to the lower digestive tract, and here they can be fermented. And this isn't, it can be good or bad, but generally what we then have is the negative impact where it promotes the growth of your pathogenic bacteria. So we see an overgrowth of them. So what this image here is showing you is the gut when phomonicins were present in feed, and these little black dots here are the bacteria which are actually adhering to the gut. And when there aren't phomonicins, we then don't see this. Okay, as I said, the cells are damaged, they're irritated, we have less water resorption, so we can see diarrhea. And then moving on, the second impact, as I said, is the impact on immune function. And mycotoxins are actually the most immunosuppressant factor coming from the feed, particularly aflatoxins. So it has the most negative impact on immunity. And what we tend to see with mycotoxins is either the animal's in this pro-inflammation status, so it's prepared for a challenge when it doesn't really need to be. And unfortunately, this diverts energy away from the mammary gland. So we're losing potential production to provide energy to the immune system. Or on the other side, we see that you don't get the immune response that you need to get in order to fight off an infection. And I'm not going to go into detail, but this is just to depict where... Sorry, can everyone still hear me? Adele, can you just confirm if we still have sound? Or anyone maybe raise their hand if they can hear me? Adele?
No problem.
Oh, thanks. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. I thought we might have a sound issue. All right, so I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty here, but basically what I want to highlight is that your innate, so your natural, your passive, and adaptive immunity are impacted by mycotoxins. So these are just the different areas within the immune system and the different toxins and where they have their effect. All right, so the big challenge is the visible part of mycotoxicosis, especially if we think of immunity, is just this little tip of the iceberg. This is when we have high contamination and clinical symptoms. But the real challenge is what's hidden under the water. And this is the subacute mycotoxicosis, which continuously weakens the immune system. And this is a result of chronic exposure to low levels of various mycotoxins. And this is the issue we're really facing and what we see on farm. It's not often that we see these clinical cases. Okay, and then lastly, as I said, mycotoxins have a very negative impact on fertility. And the toxin there is zear. So basically, zear has a similar structure to estrogen, so the female hormone. And so what it does is it goes and it binds to all the estrogen receptors in the uterus, in the mammary glands, in the liver, and we then have a hyperestrogenism. And I've just illustrated this, it here in this image. Okay, but basically what happens is we then have high levels of estrogen, low levels of progesterone, and of course progesterone is a very important hormone in maintaining pregnancy. So we often have very early pregnancy losses, ovarian cysts, reduced ovulation rates, vaginal secretions, vaginitis are all symptoms we can see. And then DON and zear actually work in combination to have a more toxic effect. So when the two are present together, we see increased reproductive tract infections, diarrhea, and potentially total reproductive failure. So zear has a very direct impact on fertility, but also keep in mind that mycotoxins work together globally to reduce fertility. So for example, if there's less nutrient absorption, you might stay in negative energy balance for longer, not get your cows back into condition after calving, so you might struggle to get them back in calf. All challenges like that. These toxins work together to have a more negative impact. All right, so I've discussed the negative impact of mycotoxins on the animal, but what about the risk of transfer into milk and other dairy products? You know, what is our health risk when it comes to mycotoxins? And the culprit here is aflatoxin, in particular aflatoxin B1. And it is known to be the most potent natural carcinogen. and plays a role in hepatic carcinoma, so liver cancer. And there was a bit of research done by Solari from 1988 to 2020. And what it shows is that aflatoxins are really a concern for your tropical areas like Africa and Asia. As you can see, they are finding it quite frequently in the milk, 79 to 82%. So how does aflatoxin M1 actually get into the milk? Or aflatoxin B1, pardon me. So aflatoxin B1 has a low molecular weight, which means it's very easily absorbed by the digestive tract by passive diffusion. So it's very rapidly absorbed. It goes through into the liver. It's metabolized there. It undergoes what is known as hydroxylation, and it then becomes aflatoxin M1. And this is then excreted in the urine and in the milk. So the extent of transfer from feed to milk is influenced by various factors, nutritional and physiological. But we tend to say that the transfer rate is on average 1 to 3%, and we work on a 1.7% average. But just keep in mind that high producing cows tend to have a higher transfer rate, particularly at the peak of lactation. So we can see a transfer of as much as 6.2%. And then if there's other toxins present, such as DON and formonicin, they of course damage that intestinal wall, so they can increase the absorption of this toxin and increase the transfer of it into the milk. So aflatoxin is ingested, it appears in the milk very quickly within 12 hours, peaks at 24 hours, and then within 4 days, it's out of the milk if they're not exposed to more mycotoxins. So it's very tricky to test for it, unfortunately. It's kind of luck of the draw, and the transfer rate also just depends, or differs between individual animals, but also throughout the day. There's day-to-day variation, even variation between milkings. So it's very tricky to pick it up in the milk. And this was just an equation that was developed by Peterson in the 90s, where they just determined how much aflatoxin M1 might be in the milk based on how much is being ingested per day. Okay, then aflatoxins in the milk, but just for interest, it's of course then carried through to all our dairy products, our cheeses, our yogurts, all of that. And they've actually found that the toxin binds to certain parts of the milk or the milk proteins. So 60% can be found in whey, and they found that 40% of aflatoxin M1 actually remains in the curd and the fresh cheese. So really what we're seeing is this high concentration in cheese compared to the initial level in milk. So we really need to control this toxin. All right, so several studies have shown that aflatoxin has a very negative impact on our health and well-being. Of course, children, we always encourage them to drink a glass of milk. It's really important for them from when they're born until they're toddlers to get enough milk in. But we need to make sure it's safe. Aflatoxin, when present, can reduce absorption of nutrients, leading to undernutrition, and suppress the immune system, leading to increased morbidity and even mortalities in your poorer countries where the children might be experiencing other challenges. Other studies have shown that it can stunt growth, so it's really not something we want to be exposing or anyone to. So in South Africa, aflatoxin M1 is actually regulated in the milk, and we cap it at 0.05 micrograms per litre of aflatoxin M1 at milk. So we don't want to exceed this. Okay, I'm going to speed up a little bit just for time. I see it's running away with us. I do want to give you time for questions. So just in terms of other dairy products and its transfer into milk, it hasn't really been extensively investigated, and we tend to not really see high levels of the other toxins coming through into milk. The other thing to keep in mind is that mycotoxins have a negative impact on milk production, but also the quality of milk, not just in terms of the safety, but your butterfat content, your protein content, your somatic cells. If rumen fermentation is impaired, fiber digestion is impaired, you will then have less butterfat. And then, of course, if the cells of the animal are irritated, if the immunity is reduced, you will then have a higher risk for subclinical mastitis, for example, and so we can see an increase in the somatic cell content of milk when mycotoxins are present. Okay, very briefly, I bumped into Yompi at large herds, and he asked me just to add a slide on facial eczema. So facial eczema is caused by sporidecinin toxin produced by the mold Pithomyces chartarum. We find it quite frequently in our ryegrass in particular. When there's been warm, moist conditions, the spores are released in the pasture, and when they're consumed by the animal, they have a very damaging effect on the liver. So we have a buildup of chlorophyll byproducts in the liver and in the system, and so basically it increases the sensitivity of the animal to sunlight. So we have this photosensitization, and unfortunately sometimes we actually see this irritation of the skin, the redding, the thickening, and the peeling of it. So very unpleasant. Unfortunately, very difficult to prevent. You can only treat it, and it doesn't appear that mycotoxin binders are effective in managing it. All right, so mycotoxins are inevitable. How can we potentially manage them? So we need to focus on reducing the risk of contamination, identifying our risk, then once we know what it is, assessing it, taking action, and then year on year reviewing our approach. So very quickly, I did touch on this earlier when I discussed it, but there's a couple of things you can do to try and reduce your risk of mycotoxin contamination. And it's going to start in the field. You need to prepare your fields properly, choose the right seeds, choose disease-resistant cultivars. Then during growing, make use of fertilizers, apply appropriate irrigation methods, use fungicides, control weeds and insects. These are all things you can control to reduce the negative impact. At harvest, the key is to focus on harvesting at the right time and to use clean equipment, not bring in too much soil as well. When you need to dry your crops, try and do it as fast as possible. And for example, if drying on the land, just put a barrier between the crop and the land. In storage, it really comes to applying good storage practices, controlling temperature and moisture, and reducing pest infestation. So how do we actually test for mycotoxins? There's various methods, and there's no one right or wrong method. And I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty, but basically you have your fully quantitative methods and your rapid methods. And your fully quantitative methods are your HPLC, which can be done at your FDAs, your SAGLs, and they really are the gold standard in testing for mycotoxins. Unfortunately, they're a little bit costly, and it takes time to get a result, which is why there's been this boom of your rapid methods, your ELISA-based methods, which allow for a much quicker result, although they aren't necessarily as accurate. In terms of monitoring the milk, it's very nice that we now have a rapid test option for detecting aflatoxin M1 in milk, so we can get a nice rapid result. Could potentially be something that we could bring in at the milk buying companies that they test each batch. Lastly, just remember that sampling is actually key. So a lot of the error comes from not taking a large enough sample. So you really need to focus on sampling correctly in order to get good, reliable results. Then just to touch on regulation of mycotoxins. They are regulated in animal feed in South Africa, and you can see the levels here. But what I want to highlight is that animals are being negatively affected at much lower levels. So it's very difficult to give a specific level at which a toxin will have a negative impact. But what I can provide you with is guidelines depending on whether it's a dairy cow, beef cattle, or a young animal, and sort of where the risk is higher or lower. But we can't give a set in stone value. And this is because many factors influence toxicity. The breed of the animal, the age and the gender, how long they've been exposed to the contaminated feed, if there's any infection that they're dealing with or heat stress, and then as I mentioned earlier, if we have multiple mycotoxins present. All right, so if you suspect that mycotoxins are present, you need to take the following actions. Withdraw the problem feed ingredients. It's not often possible. So then you need to look at diluting it or lowering the inclusion rate in the ration. Support your animal, provide antioxidants. and make sure the ration is well balanced, that they're getting all the nutrients that they need, and then use a mycotoxin binder or absorbent to help protect them. So very briefly, when looking at how to bind mycotoxins, what we need to consider is that there's very wide variability in the mycotoxins. So they all have different properties. Your aflatoxins are quite small, they're quite flat. Your zear is a very large molecule, it's a very flexible molecule. And then your DON, your trichothecenes, are very rigid in shape. So it's really tricky to find one binder that can protect you against all these toxins, but that's what you need. All right, so if we look at the options for managing mycotoxins, one is using a binder or absorbent. So this is a large molecule which can't itself be absorbed by the gut, and it binds the toxin and removes it from the system in the feces. It doesn't let go of that toxin at any point. Most typically, it's our mineral clays that are used for this, and your HCCSAs or your aflatoxin selective clays. So your clays are very good at binding aflatoxin, depending on purity though, just keep that in mind. But they have very limited efficacy against ochratoxin, zear, phomonicins, and DON. So then what we have is a modification of clays where we enhance their surface area so that they can bind more toxins or a broader spectrum of mycotoxins. And there's various technologies on the market. Activated carbon is an age-old one that was used. It's a very good binder, but it's a non-specific binder. It will bind your minerals and your vitamins. Yeast cell walls are quite frequently used, and they are very effective against your flexible mycotoxins. So your zear and your ochratoxin, but they have very limited efficacy against your aflatoxins. And then there's also various polymers that pop up from time to time that one can use. The other option you have is to use a biotransforming agent. So this is a microbe, so a bacteria, a fungi, or a yeast, or an enzyme produced by one of these microbes that can then detoxify the toxin so that we have a less toxic metabolite. So it doesn't actually bind the mycotoxin, it biotransforms the mycotoxin into a molecule that's less toxic. And then lastly, you can support the animal. So a lot of the products on the market include vitamins, liver protectors, antioxidants, molecules to reinforce the gut barrier. So this is great. It supports the animal through the challenge, but it's not binding that mycotoxin in any way. And what you will see is on the market, most mycotoxins contain some combination of all three of these. Okay, so wrapping it up, I don't know if you're aware, but there are more than 80 mycotoxin binders registered in South Africa. And I just want to give you a few tips on how to evaluate a binder. Firstly, what toxins can it absorb? Can it protect you against a broad spectrum of mycotoxins? Because that's what you actually want. What is the specificity? So will it have a negative impact on your minerals? Will it actually bind minerals and nutrients? It's important to know. Velocity, how quick does it act? You want to be binding those mycotoxins in the mouth already as quickly as you can. What is the backing behind this product? What is the scientific support? What is the safety, the quality, the regulations behind the product? If it's a clay, how pure is it? And then feed technology, particularly for products that make use of microbes or enzymes to biotransform toxins. You need to know what is the pelleting stability of these products. And then also look for proven local results. At the end of the day, what happens on farm and what we see is really what's important. So sorry I went a bit over time. It's a big topic to cover and something I'm very passionate about. But my take-home message for today is really that mycotoxins are there. They're unfortunately not going anywhere. They're inevitable. We can try and manage them, in field and crop, but they are there prior to harvest. And there's really not all that much we can do once we harvest other than have good storage facilities. Okay, when making silage, proper silage management is critical. Keep out that oxygen. And then I always say control the controllables. You're not going to get rid of molds and mycotoxins, but control the aspects that you can to reduce the further development of them. Assume mycotoxins are present and proactively manage your herd to reduce their negative impact. All right, and then just keep in mind that these toxins have a significant economic effect. So firstly, just the effect of plant yield losses. Then the second factor is poor animal health and performance. And then the contamination of crops and the products, such as cheese, yogurt, milk. They all come with a cost. We're losing something. And they found that in America, on average, the economic impact or losses just due to aflatoxin and just due to the loss in plant yield is 225 million per year. So I don't know what that might be in South Africa. And I don't even know what that might be if you look at DON, Phomonicin, Zea, for example, and your Fusarium graminarium, what that losses in terms of the crop yield, but then also the negative impacts on the animal. And so really the message that I want to end with today is that you need to feed a mycotoxin binder. I wish it was like in this cartoon here where we could just do some Tai Chi for healthy crop growth, and that through giving out good vibes we could succeed. But at the end of the day, mycotoxins are there. And you need to feed a mycotoxin binder. You need to be protecting the herd with every bite of feed that they take. And I really want to encourage the milk buyers to push back on the milk producers and make sure that they are feeding a mycotoxin binder. At the end of the day, there's a massive risk for a negative impact on human health. And we want to produce safe and hygienic milk. And to do this, to safely do this, and to guarantee that we can do this is to include a mycotoxin binder. So sorry for running a little bit over time, but I hope this was valuable. Here's my contact details below if you want me to discuss anything in more detail with you or reach out to me with any questions. Thanks, Del.